Well, good morning, everyone. This is Jack Zemlicka, Managing Editor of Strip Till Farmer, and welcome to the debut of our Strip Till Farmer webinar series. Today's event is brought to you and other pre-registrants free, courtesy of Ingersoll. And today's program is Analyzing the Strip Till System, a comparative breakdown of practices, products, and progress. So strip till is an imperfect farming practice, and some variables can't be conquered, but strip tillers can curb the impact Mother Nature has on their crops with a flexible, progressive system in place, which may include a customized cover cropping strategy, well-timed strip building, and use of implement guidance technology. Each of these areas saw growth during the 2016 cropping season based on analysis of the 4th Annual Strip Till Operational Practices Benchmark Study. And this is a one-of-a-kind report that tracked emerging trends and annual contrasts in the tools and techniques strip tillers are utilizing on their operations. In today's live webinar event, I'm going to share and evaluate the results of the 2017 benchmark study based on the responses of nearly 450 farmers from 20 states and Canada, to include shifting equipment preferences, berm building strategies, fertilization practices, and precision technology adoption. So before we get going today, just a quick housekeeping item for attendees. If for any reason your internet connection or even our connection should happen to fail at some point and it looks like the webinar has been interrupted, you can go back to the email you received earlier telling you how to join the program and re-enter the webinar that way. So with that, I wanted to thank you again for joining us, and I appreciate you being with us here for the first in our Strip Till Farmer webinar series. And looking at the analysis that I'm going to present today, I'm going to compare and contrast the 2016 cropping practices, equipment, and technology strip tillers are utilizing in their operation with prior years, while also evaluating the specific fertilizers, cover crops, and precision tools strip tillers are also utilizing in their operation. So just to get going here, I wanted to share a little overview of us. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with our company and what we're doing on the farmer side, but we're obviously Lessiter Media based in Brookfield, Wisconsin, and a few of our farmer titles, obviously Strip Till Farmer and our National Strip Tillage Conference, which is coming up here in just a couple of weeks in Omaha, Nebraska on August 3rd and 4th. Our Strip Till podcast, and we also, of course, have our No Till Farmer title and our National No Tillage Conference, which celebrated its 25th anniversary this year, and the No Till Farmer podcast. So just a little overview of what I'm going to discuss this morning. As I mentioned, kind of looking at some of the analysis of the 2016 cropping season based on the results of our study. And as you can see, that we had a record number of farmers respond to this year's study, and we've got a nice sample size here to evaluate of different practices. And as you can see, I'm going to go through some of the geographic breakdowns, some of the highlights there, talk a little bit about some of the yield differences we've seen over the past few years, look at the different equipment setups. Certainly cover cropping is a huge movement, especially in the strip till side. Looking at some of the different application adjustments we've seen, the precision adoption we've seen as well. And then kind of this is one of the interesting parts that we like to do is kind of take a look and segment out the top 10% of our respondents, and this is based on corn and soybean yields. So that's just an overview, and getting in here, I'd like to just start out by sharing a little bit of the geographic breakdown of what we saw based on the results this year. So looking at participants by region, we again saw that the Corn Belt maintained its stronghold here. And you can see, looking at the chart, that about 80% of strip tillers, and that's up about 2% from last year, are located in the either the Eastern Corn Belt the Western Corn Belt, or Great Lakes region. And then for the third year in a row, we saw that Illinois led the way with 90 respondents to the survey. And that's actually 22 more than last year's study. And then followed up by Iowa with 69, and then Minnesota with 47. And then rounding out the top states that were represented in the 2017 study were Ohio, Wisconsin, South Dakota, Indiana, and then Nebraska. So one of the interesting things we saw is that while Midwestern states continue to populate the top strip till locations in 2016, there were two other regions that gained ground, and that was the Northeast, which would include New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. And that increased, although it's a small percentage, from 2.6% to 4.3% in 2016. And the Appalachia region, which would include Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and Virginia. And that was less than 1%, and now that's almost 2%. So interesting to see some development in those areas in strip till. Another area that we analyzed kind of in the demographic element was looking at kind of the age range and then the experience level of strip tillers. And in 2016, we saw, well, in 2015, I should say, we saw both youth and inexperience were very well served. And we found that about 22% of respondents were under 35 years old, and about 38% were under 45. And looking at kind of the experience level, we had about 42% that reported being strip tillers for less than 5 years, and about 28% had been strip tilling at least 10 years. And that actually was the smallest number we had seen in 3 years in 2015. This year's study revealed kind of an interesting dynamic, and it was skewing a little bit older and more experienced. So we had about 46% of respondents to this year's survey were 55 or over. And that's compared to about 44% last year, and 20% also saying that they've been strip tilling at least 16 years. And that's actually a record high in the 4-year history of the study. And that's including about 10% who had strip tilled more than 20 years as of 2016. So kind of on the other end of the spectrum though, about 36% said that they had been strip tilling less than 5 years. And that was actually compared to a high of 42% in last year's study. So I think it's going to be worth watching to see, you know, if this transition continues to take hold in the coming years, how the next generation of strip tillers will evolve their on-farm methods. Interestingly, and this was kind of, you know, something that caught my eye, was only about 1.5% from of the respondents to this year's study were under 25 years old. And it was actually a record low, and then continuing a 3-year downward trend. So here's kind of our first breakdown of the top 10%, and this is the geographic and demographic breakdown. And I suppose not surprisingly, we saw the Midwestern dominance reinforced by that top 10%. Some 95% of those top strip tillers were from either the Eastern Corn Belt, Western Corn Belt, or Great Lakes regions. I think it's also noteworthy that 42% of the top yielding strip tillers from the Eastern Corn Belt is actually about twice the percentage of last year's study, while the total from the Western Corn Belt dropped about 7 points from last year's total. So kind of breaking down by states for that top 10%, Illinois led the way with about 37%, and that's actually more than the combined total of the next two highest states, Iowa and Nebraska. So interestingly, Nebraska actually led the way last year with 25% of the top yielding strip tillers. So quite a shift there in the region in terms of where the highest yielding strip tillers were coming from. Overall though, we did have 9 different states that were represented among the top 10%. So some good diversity there amongst the highest yielding strip tillers. So kind of taking a look at the age breakdown then, we did find that the majority were at least 45 years old. About 46% were 55 or older, and this is kind of something else we saw. Unlike last year, this actually equated to more experience in strip till. And we saw that about 43% of the top strip tillers had been strip tilling at least 11 years, and about 10% for more than 20 years. So only a third had been strip tilling for 5 to 10 years, and that's down from 50% we saw last year in this category. So one thing of note though is that the number strip tilling less than 5 years actually increased from 21% last year to about 25% in this year's study. So, you know, a pretty interesting mix of experience and age. I think it, you know, certainly varies a little bit from the overall group, but certainly something to keep an eye on. So this was an interesting breakdown that we certainly saw as well in this year's study. And 2016 really saw some significant increases in both the number of acres farmers are dedicating to strip till, with measurable growth in both corn and soybean acres over the 2015 cropping year. So overall, respondents reported strip tilling a record of almost 470,000 acres. And this is actually a 12% increase over what we saw in last year's study. And on average, farmers reported strip tilling about 75% of their total acreage. And this is the highest total we've seen in the history of the study, and well ahead of the last two studies, which only averaged about 63%. So that's a pretty substantial jump. Interestingly then, for the first time in 3 years, the average number of acres farmers strip tilled actually declined slightly from about 1,100 in last year's study to just slightly over 1,100, so 1,112, and you can see on the chart there this year. So, but you know, it was interesting that the average is actually still well ahead of those reported for 2015 and 14. So, you know, despite a marginal decline in the average acres, that's still well ahead of what we saw in some of the earlier studies. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if the growth in strip till acreage continues in the coming years. And by comparison, we wanted to kind of put the numbers in this study against what had been collected and analyzed in the 9th annual no-till operational benchmark study, which you may be familiar with. It was published by No-Till Farmer earlier this year. And those results revealed that only about 16% of respondents strip till, and that's actually up slightly from their prior year's total of about 14%. So, so we're kind of seeing, you know, growth measured both in the no-till benchmark and certainly with the strip till study that we're doing. So in terms of strip tilled crops, not surprisingly, I mean, we've seen, you know, corn dominate since we started doing the study, and that remained king again with, you know, more than 98% of respondents strip tilling the crop. Pretty consistent with what we've seen the last 3 years, which averaged around 97%. So, but it was interesting. So for the first time, we did see more than half of our respondents said they strip tilled soybeans. And that's actually a double-digit increase over 2015. So certainly seeing some growth there. You know, it'll be interesting to see. You know, I'm sure economics may have played a role in that, but you know, seeing if that's a shift we'll continue to see. And I know talking with some strip tillers, you know, they acknowledge that they did, you know, look to shift, you know, the acres they allotted to corn this year, and I think the study would reflect, you know, kind of certainly the growth not only in corn acres but a revival of the soybean acres as well. So, so kind of when talking with a few farmers as well, you know, about what their cropping plans were going into 2016. You know, they admitted that, you know, the price of corn and soybeans was going to play into their decision making, but kind of asking, you know, if they plan to adjust the number of acres they strip tilled based on a change in their crop rotation. Most of the guys I talked to didn't see a need. So, and I think the study kind of bears that out as we saw the average number of strip tilled corn acres increase for the 3rd straight year in 2016. And as you can see, kind of the progression starting at 717 in 2013, moving all the way up to 876 last year. So some pretty steady growth there in the number of the average number of acres that are in strip-till corn. And then, by that same token, after a little bit of a slip, strip-tilled soybean acres rebounded, and we saw an average of 430 acres per farm. That's up from 2015, but as you'll notice, still a little bit down from what we had seen the two prior years in 14 and 13. So kind of digging into the yields here, and this is where we saw some really interesting shifts after some pretty consistent years the last couple. Strip tillers will admit, that increasing yields isn't always their primary motivation for adopting the practice. But accommodating growing conditions and some cooperation from Mother Nature last year certainly contribute to what we saw as a nearly double-digit bump in average corn yields in 2016. So as you can see, after back-to-back years of averaging about 191 bushels per acre of corn, last year respondents averaged about 199, and that's by far the highest total that we'd seen in the history of our study. And then kind of doing a little bit of digging here, we took a look at kind of the regional success, and what we found was that farmers in the Western Corn Belt averaged about 212 bushels, and in the Eastern Corn Belt they averaged about 203. Strip tillers in the Great Lakes averaged about 198, and then those in the Northern Plains were at about 180. So, a little bit of diversity there, but overall pretty solid yields throughout the different regions. Certainly, some of this success was pretty well documented in some of those Midwestern states last year. So I think we see that bear out certainly with our results as well. So consistent with prior years, we did see strip-tilled corn out yield other tillage systems. And again, comparing with no-till farmers' recent benchmark study, as you can see, farmers utilizing vertical tillage averaged about 186 bushels per acre. Those in a minimum tillage system averaged about 177, and then no-tillers reported 171 bushels per acre of corn. So we had also seen strip-till soybean yields continue to increase, and this is for the third straight year. And last year, respondents reported an all-time high average of 62 bushels per acre. And this marks a 4 bushel per acre increase over 2015, and then an 8 bushel bump over 2014. So, and then also kind of looking back, comparing with what the no-till farmer study revealed, for the fourth year in a row, strip-tilled soybeans out-yielded no-till soybeans, and again, progressively increasing that gap by about a bushel per year. So in 2016, strip-tilled soybeans topped no-till, which recorded 58 bushels per acre, as you can see, and then vertical tillage was at 59 and minimum till at 57. So taking again a look at that top 10%, and probably not surprising here, but they also enjoyed very measurable yield gains for both strip-tilled corn and soybeans. And the average corn yield among the top 10% was 250 bushels per acre, and that's actually 7 bushels over what we had recorded in 2015, and 14 bushels higher than what we had in 2014. So again, some pretty significant gains there. And just kind of out of curiosity, but also wanted to see where the highest yields came on an individual basis, and we actually had 2 farmers, one in the Great Lakes region and another in the Western Corn Belt, reported corn averages of 280 bushels per acre in 2016. So kind of taking a look then at the top 10% of soybean strip tillers, they enjoyed actually even more dramatic yield increase than the overall group. What we saw was an all-time high average of 72 bushels per acre, and that's an 8 bushel bump over the last 2 years. And there was slightly more geographic diversity among the top yielding soybean strip tillers. we actually saw the highest average reported at 90 bushels per acre, and that was from an operation in the Western Corn Belt. We had another one reporting an 80 bushel per acre average out of the Western Corn Belt, and then the third highest was 77 bushels per acre from the Eastern Corn Belt. So, again, kind of validating the success that a lot of the strip tillers, certainly in those regions, had in 2016. So kind of shifting here into obviously some of the preparation that goes into getting soil ready to be able to enjoy and kind of nurture those high yields that strip tillers saw. Certainly strip tillers will admit that timing is everything when building strips. And chatting with farmers during the last year, it seems that more are becoming loyal to one time of the year or the other, depending on convenience, weather, or availability of hired help on when they're going to build those strips. And we certainly saw these preferences even more pronounced in the results of the strip till benchmark study compared to prior years. So as you can see, the percentage of farmers who prefer to build strips in the fall or spring both increased by double digits for the 2016 cropping season. For the third year in a row, we did see the majority of strip tillers prefer fall strip till, with about 55% getting back into the field after harvest. And this is actually a 13-point increase over 2015, and then a 17-point jump over what we saw in 2014. So, pretty substantial growth there for fall strips. But those farmers preferring to build strips ahead of planting also increased. And it was actually from a low of 28% in 2015 to a new high of about 40% last year. So, as you can see, it kind of correlates with more defined preferences. Would make sense that the percentage of respondents who strip till in both spring and fall declined to about 30%. And that was from a high that we saw of about 35% in 2015. So kind of taking a look then at the top 10% in terms of berm building preferences, we saw about half that prefer to strip till exclusively in fall. And as you can see, only about 20% were purely spring, which was half the overall group, which was pretty interesting. So obviously a big differential there in terms of the overall group and the top 10% on when they have preferences for building their berms. So kind of starting to dig here into the setups of equipment and the equipment itself. And obviously there's a variety of options, variety of ways, that strip tillers can set up their row units. Certainly field conditions and soil and weather play, a lot of factors into what those preferences are going to be. And, while our data revealed pretty dramatic year-over-year differences in when farmers build strips, we didn't see nearly as much variance in the type of row unit setups strip tillers utilize. It was actually split fairly evenly, and we had at least 37% of respondents who used either a shank style, coulter, or mole knife setups on their strip till rig. And touching base with a couple of farmers and during visits throughout the last year, I noticed that several had added new, used, or modified secondary strip till rigs to use during different seasons, with shanks more commonly associated, obviously, with fall strips, coulters being more utilized in the spring. And, while strip tillers, often have an ideal window of when they'd like to build strips, it's not always possible. And that's certainly something that bears out, when talking with farmers. So, I'll often hear about the importance of having a backup plan with the right equipment. That can be a real benefit, in case things don't go according to plan each season. So that was interesting to notice that I saw quite a few more secondary strip till units that had either been pieced together or purchased on different strip tillers farms this year. So for the fourth year in a row, though, the most popular setup was the shank style row units, although we did see the percentage decline during the last 2 years. And about 42% of strip tillers utilize shanks, and that was obviously compared to 44 and 46% the last couple of years before that. So, you know, a little bit of a shift there, not too much. We did see coulter setups increase about 5% year over year. And again, that kind of supports the increase that had been reported in spring strip till in 2016. But it's worth noting, you know, the total we saw in 2016 was well below the 45% who preferred coulter setups in 2014. A little bit of an increase as well on the mold knife setups, you know, by about 1.5%. So pretty consistent there with strip tillers preferring that setup. But one of the new questions that we added to this year's study, and we wanted to kind of take a closer look at residue management practices. And, you know, we kind of consider this in to a certain extent in kind of the setup preferences that strip tillers have, obviously not only on their strip till rigs, but certainly their other equipment. And what we saw, as you can see, by far the most popular method was row cleaners. And, you know, those are obviously very effective, whether they're on the planter or their strip till rig. I mean, you can see, you know, almost 3/4 preferred that on the strip till rig, and more than, you know, 86% on a planter. Running a distant third was sizing the residue with combine attachments. So a little over 1/4 of respondents utilizing that tool. So kind of some additional notes here that are worth sharing just on the setup aspect. Despite the increase in strip till acreage, we did notice that the size of machines farmers pulled through their fields in 2016 remained relatively unchanged compared to the prior year. We found that the most popular size strip till rig in 2016 was a 12-row machine, with about 43% of respondents preferring that size rig. That's pretty consistent with what we've seen in 2015 and 2014, kind of the low to mid 40%. So we did see about 30% that utilize 16-row rigs, and that's pretty much on par with what we'd seen in the prior years. About 19% run smaller units, 6 or 8-row strip till rigs. We did find a handful of strip tillers noting that they actually run 4-row machines. You know, I'm wondering if that's more on the experimental side, doing some test plots or some very small acreage. On the other end of the spectrum, though, we found that about 6% run 24-row strip till rigs, and that's, you know, marginally higher than what we saw in 2015. In 2014, it's kind of hovered around that 5-6%. So haven't seen a tremendous amount of growth there in the size of strip till rig that farmers are using. One of the other things we looked at too was just tractor horsepower needed to pull strip till rigs, and we found that that's continuing to inch upward. Saw that kind of bear out in 2016. Saw an average of about 328 horsepower, and that compares to about 325 in 2015. But kind of looking at, since we started tracking that in 2013, strip tillers have actually increased tractor horsepower needs by about 50 in just 4 years. So I think that's something worth watching in the coming years. And that's interesting, you know, in spite of the fact that we haven't really seen a correlation in the size of strip till rig really growing, but certainly farmers are using a little bit more horsepower on average to pull what they've got. So taking a look here at the top 10%, and what the highest yielding strip tillers are doing as far as kind of their equipment setup. We're seeing the majority are still utilizing shank systems. It's about, you know, 52%, but it's actually about a 7% drop over 2015. Still well ahead though of what we saw in 2014, which was only about 27%. So we did see the biggest gain actually came in the number of strip tillers using mole knives, and that was about 42% compared to just about 31% in 2015, about the same as well in 2014. And then we also saw some growth in coulter systems among the top strip tillers, from about 25% in 2015 up to about 30% last year. So interestingly, we did kind of take a look though that about a quarter of the top yielding strip tillers utilized multiple row unit setups on their strip till rigs. So it's a combination of using shanks or coulters, or kind of mix and matching depending on the season, and I think that kind of signals a seasonal flexibility, and a willingness to match equipment setup to field conditions. So kind of looking at the size of units among the top strip tillers, pretty consistent with the overall group. About 46% ran the 12-row strip till rigs. This was well below the 62% who ran 12-row machines in 2015. So pretty interesting drop there. We did find that making up some of the difference there, though, was actually the number of strip tillers running 8-row machines. And this total actually increased from less than 1% in 2015 to nearly 13% last year. So that's a pretty big spike of the top guys that were running 16-row machines, or 8-row machines, excuse me. But actually, we did see some increase as well in the top strip tillers running 16-row machines, from about 30% in 2015 up to around 36% last year. So it did just want to take a quick break here, but wanted to thank and recognize Ingersoll Tillage Group for supporting this webinar, and wanted to just welcome in Roger Murdoch here for a brief message. Roger is the Vice President of Brand Management with Ingersoll, and he's got a special priority offer for our strip till audience.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks to Strip Till Farmer. For more than 100 years, Ingersoll has been producing the highest quality coulters and discs, and our mission is to be the best supplier of world-class ground-engaging solutions for our customers. As a title sponsor of the National Strip Tillage Conference, I want to extend a special offer to you to join us at this year's event, coming up on August 3 through 4 in Omaha, Nebraska. Right now, receive a $25 discount on a full registration to the 2017 Strip Tillage Conference simply by calling 866-839-8455 and mention promotion code Ingersoll, or visit striptillconference.com/Ingersoll to take advantage of this discounted registration. Learn more about our entire product line at ingersolltillage.com. And stop by and see us at the National Strip Tillage Conference.
Well, thank you, Roger, and Ingersoll for their support of today's program and the National Strip Tillage Conference. And I appreciate everybody tuning in today to learn more about what we're doing this year with some of our analysis and study from the 2017 Strip Till Operational Benchmark Study. So that was a good segue from Roger, I think, back into taking a look at kind of the brand breakdown. And this is always one of the more interesting categories to kind of dissect each year. And we've been doing this now since we started the study. But, we've certainly seen, overall farmers tend to be very brand loyal when it comes to equipment. But, when you're talking about strip tillers, I think there tends to be a pretty innovative streak that runs through many of them. As they look to update, improve, or even rebuild the strip till rigs they have. Sitting down, I had the opportunity at the National No Tillage Conference back in January to sit down with a diverse group of strip tillers for a roundtable discussion. And I remember one at the table noting that in strip till, if you haven't gone through a dozen equipment preparations, you haven't gotten where you need to be. So I think when looking at strip tillers, they have a multitude of customizable options to adapt to their operation, and I think the results here of our brand breakdown revealed a competitive market with no company strip till rig reaching at least 20% for the first time in the history of the study. But a couple of highlights here from the table. We did see for the third year, Kuhn-Krause proved to be the most popular strip till rig run by respondents at about 17%, although the total was down about 3 points from 2015 and about 5 points from 2014. Ranking second for the third year in a row was Case IH DMI at about 16%. That's up about 2 points from 2015. And they were followed by Dawn Equipment, which moved up 1 spot over 2015. And then Orthman, which was down 1 spot, and then Environmental Tillage Systems. So just kind of rounding up the top 10, we saw John Deere, Thurston Manufacturing, Yetter, Unverferth, and then Twin Diamond. So kind of looking then at the top 10% on which brand of rig the highest yielding strip tillers preferred, Kuhn-Krause was at the top of the list with about 27%. That was about 10 points higher than obviously the percentage of the overall group. Coming in second was Orthman at about 17%. That was about down 8% after holding the top spot in 2015. And overall, though, it was interesting. We did see 14 different manufacturers represented among the top strip tillers, which I thought was pretty interesting. Looking just at that top 10%, to have 14 different brands represented was pretty interesting. So kind of now looking at an area which what I see and hear from strip tillers, is something that is of high interest. There seems to be as many questions sometimes as there are answers when we're talking about cover cropping, but I think it's fair to say that cover crops started as somewhat of an enigma in strip till, with farmers researching and testing the best mixes and seeding methods to achieve the desired results. But I think the last few years have seen just an explosion in the adoption and application of cover cropping in strip till, and that's certainly true in other conservation tillage systems as well. So in just 4 years of tracking the use of cover crops in strip till systems, we did see the practice grow more than 17% to a high of about 61% in 2016, as revealed in an analysis of the benchmark study. And the percentage of farmers planting cover crops in strip till fields that started at about 44% in 2013, so well below 50%. And we've certainly seen that grow steadily each year, as you can see certainly by the charts on this page here. And I think strip tillers' incorporation of cover crops is trending on the same plane as reported in No-Till Farmers' 9th annual no-till operational benchmark study. So, and their results revealed that some 77% of respondents said they utilized cover crops, which was an all-time high and an increase for the 4th straight year. So, certainly, if you're talking about those two tillage practices, you're seeing some significant interest and growth in cover cropping practices. So one of the areas we dug a little bit deeper in on the cover cropping side was getting a sense from strip tillers as to what are the most popular varieties that they're seeding. And as you can see, this is for the 3rd year in a row, cereal rye topped the list for the most popular cover crop species, and about 70% of respondents reported seeding cereal rye in 2016, and that we've seen that grow, and that's about comparing to 65% in 2015, and it's up about 10% from what we saw in 2014. So kind of taking a look at some of the other highlights on the list, after a 10-point dip in 2014 to 2015, we did see radishes stabilize as the 2nd most utilized cover crop at just over 51%, and that was followed by oats, which was also a pretty popular species being seeded by strip tillers as well. And kind of just rounding out the top 5, what we saw, annual ryegrass, about a 3rd. And that was interesting though, because that actually has continued a downward trend in usage, dropping about 14 points since 2014. And then that was followed by rapeseed at about 28%, and that's about a 6-point bump over 2015. So another one of the new questions we asked in this year's study was to ask strip tillers to identify their preferred method for seeding cover crops. And we offered a variety of choices, and far and away the most popular option was drilling them in, with about 45% of respondents preferring this method. Distant second was aerial application, just over a quarter, followed by spreading cover crops at about 23%. And then what we saw was next most popular was air seeder application at about 17%, then highboy application at 13%, and then about 10% interseeded their cover crops in 2016. It was interesting to see just kind of some of the interesting write-in methods. A handful of respondents noted that they seeded cover crops with their strip till rig. Other methods including broadcasting and then incorporating them with a vertical tillage unit. I thought perhaps most interestingly was we had one respondent note that they actually apply their cover crops by helicopter. So I had not heard of that before, so I thought that was pretty unique. So again, kind of breaking out the top 10% here in terms of cover cropping practices. As you can see, I mean, cover crops, even more popular with 70% of the top strip tillers utilizing them in 2016, about 9 points ahead of the overall group, 2 points higher than 2015 among the top strip tillers. And then we also saw about 60% prefer drilling in their cover crop seed, and that's again about 15% more than the overall group. So kind of moving on then from cover crop seeding to corn and soybean seeding, we always like to kind of take a look at the rates on the populations that strip tillers are using, kind of grabbing the averages and comparing them year over year. And we did see the average in 2016 increased slightly to just over 33,000 seeds per acre. And that's slightly ahead of the average that we saw in 2015, which was 32,970. But we did see, the 2016 number did kind of bring the average back in line with the average that we saw in 2014 and 2013. So not a dramatic shift by any means, a very minor bump. But we did see the year-over-year increase did widen the gap between corn seeding populations for strip tillers and the average rate for no tillers, which, as you can see, was actually 31,403 seeds per acre, as reported by the No-Till Farmer benchmark study. So on the soybean side, strip tillers also there, it marginally increased their average seeding population rate, and that's just slightly up from what we saw in 2015. But again, the average is still below what we saw in 2014 and 2013, pretty significantly. So overall, strip tillers have certainly been able to dial back some of those soybean seeding rates. We also did see last year's total was about 3,400 seeds per acre, lower than the average planted by no-tillers, and that was also based out of the analysis from the No-Till Farmer benchmark study. So interesting comparison there. Certainly differences within year to year, looking at just strip till, but obviously comparing the no-till as well. You can certainly see some differences there in the seeding rates, especially on the soybean side. So kind of taking a closer look at that top 10%, while the average corn seeding rate for the overall group increased, top 10% actually trimmed their average rate by about 1,000 seeds per acre in 2016. And they averaged about 33,800 seeds per acre. and that was comparing to 34,750 in 2015. Even more of a dramatic, though, cut on the soybean side, as we saw rates among the top 10% drop by about 10,000 seeds per acre to 131,071 in 2016, compared to a little over 142,000 in 2015. So some interesting shifts there, certainly on the seeding side, not only among the top 10%, but the overall group, and that'll be something worth watching heading into the kind of the fifth year of the benchmark next year. I'll be curious to see, how these stack up going back all the way to the beginning, and if there's some, even more substantial trends to kind of pull out of there. So obviously another big element of any strip till system is going to be that fertility plan, and timing, type, and technique for fertilizer application really can span a wide spectrum for strip tillers. And past results of the annual strip till benchmark study reveal some subtle and dramatic changes year to year. However, what we saw with this year's study really kind of showed some consistency among strip tillers with their preferred fertilizer products and application practices. What we see by far the most popular form of fertilizer application remained banding, and what we found was banding about an average of 6 inches beneath the soil surface proved to be the most popular combination. And as you can see noted there, a little over 68% prefer this method. It's about 3 points higher than what we saw in 2015, but actually still well below the 74% we saw in 2014. So dipping slightly in 2016 were strip tillers that mixed fertilizer into the berm, as you can see, about 35%, and then also those who apply nutrients between the berm, and that's obviously a far lower percentage than banding or mixing. So the number of strip tillers using dry fertilizer boxes, we saw that continue to increase as well in 2016, with about 63% utilizing a mounted or pull type system, and that compares to about 61% in 2015 and then 56% in 2014. So certainly seeing some continued growth in utilization of those dry boxes in a strip till operation. So I'll be curious to see if that trend continues going into next year. A new question we added to this year's study, we asked strip tillers if they own their own sprayer, and as you can see, overwhelmingly the answer was yes, with about 88% saying that they do in fact own their own sprayer. So we wanted to compare that with the no-till benchmark study, and that was actually about 5 points higher from what they saw. And their study found that 83% of no-tillers either owned a self-propelled or pull-type sprayer. And then we also found that while banding fertilizer beneath the berm remained the most common method among the top strip tillers, there was about 77% preferring this method. As you can see, that's above the overall group, although down slightly from the 80% that we saw in 2015. And roughly about another 29% opted to mix fertilizer into the strips in 2016. And interesting, we only found one of the top 10% strip tillers who cited application between the berms as a preferred method. So, certainly consistent with the overall group, not nearly as popular of a fertilizing method as banding or placing fertilizer, mixing it into the strip. So kind of digging a little deeper here into the fertilization practices. What we found here was, for the most part, strip tillers again remained pretty consistent with the timing of their nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium applications compared to 2015. Side dress application of N was only one of two methods that increased in popularity in 2016, moving from 67 to 70% last year. And there was the other modest increase was strip tillers who make pre-plant applications of P and K, and that went from 16.5% in 2015 to 17.9% last year. So as you can see here in the chart, this kind of breaks down the timing of nitrogen applications, and the biggest decline came in strip tillers who apply N in spring strips, and that dropped almost 5% compared to 2015. And while not represented here on the chart, the other big drop came in strip tillers who side dress their P and K, and that was about a 3% dip year over year, down to about 3.4% in 2016. So kind of looking at the types of nitrogen that farmers are applying in with their strip till rigs. Interestingly, and I know it's very much a split camp here, but anhydrous ammonia dropped almost 5%, or 5 points, I should say, from 2015, which was about 30.6%, to an all-time low of about 25%. So this total is nearly 15 points off the 2014 total. And again, strip tillers have debated the cost versus environmental impact of using anhydrous as a primary source of nitrogen. So interesting that we've kind of seen that trend down here the last few years. Urea continued to be the second most popular form of N, with about 24% making applications in 2016, compared to about 25% last year, and only about 15% in 2014. So kind of taking a look at the most common forms of potassium applied with the strip till rig, a little more than 57% applied potash in 2016, and that's up from 2015. And interestingly, though, the number of strip tillers making potassium chloride applications dipped last year to just under 6%, after a high of 7.5% in 2015. So application of monoammonium phosphate, MAP, increased for the third consecutive year to an all-time high of almost 40% in 2016. And we found that this was actually nearly double the percentage reported in 2013, when it was only about 23%, so pretty significant jump there. And then also on the rise is the use of diammonium phosphate, or DAP, as a source of phosphorus. And that was applied by about 34% of strip tillers in 2016. That's up about 2.5% from what we saw in 2015. So this is always, one of my favorite areas to look at as far as nutrient application, and we tried to kind of roll in a few more micronutrients here, but we do like to kind of look at micronutrient applications with the strip till rig, and we did see several measurable increases in 2016 after some declines more or less in the prior year. So about 40% of strip tillers applied sulfur in 2016. That's up more than 2 points from 2015, while about 31% applied zinc, and that's also up from 2015. Some of the other increases we saw on the micronutrient side was the percentage of strip tillers who applied boron to a high of 11.5% last year, and that compares to about 9.7% in 2015. So kind of breaking out that top 10% again, the most popular application method for nitrogen was again side dressing, so consistent with the overall group. 65% of the top strip tillers preferring this method, but that's actually a 15% increase over 2015. Second most common method was at plant application at about 43%, and that was followed by a banded application in spring strips at about 41%, and then a banded application in fall strips, which was about a third, although that was up more than 5 points over 2015. Interestingly, only about 22% of the top strip tillers applied anhydrous in 2016, also down about 8 points over 2015. And we also found that about 1/4, that was about 1/4 of the number in 2014 when it was up over 62%. So again, pretty dynamic shift there among the top strip tillers in terms of their use of anhydrous. The majority of top strip tillers prefer to ban their P and K in fall strips, with about 55% going this route, and that's an increase of more than 10% over 2015, but pretty in line with what we saw in 2014. We also saw that about 34% apply their P and K in spring strips, and that was down significantly from what we saw in 2015 when it was 48%. But again, that's pretty close to what we saw in 2014 when it was about 37%. So maybe just an anomaly year over year, but certainly we'll keep an eye on that next year, see if that continues to trend up or if it levels out again. So among those top strip tillers, potash was the most popular form of phosphorus applied, with a high of 57%, and that's nearly double from what we saw in 2015, followed by MAP, which was about 34%. So that was actually down pretty significantly from what we saw in 2015, but again, consistent with that 2014 total. So kind of taking a look here at another pretty integral part of many strip tillers operations, and that's precision technology. And certainly, it can be argued that auto steer and GPS guidance might be considered standard on many farms, and we did see that more progressive systems like variable rate drives, implement guidance, and even unmanned aerial vehicles have been more inconsistently adopted, even among the strip till crowd. However, we did see that use of RTK level GPS correction for strip till operations increased slightly to a record high last year of 81.3%. That's an 11% bump over what we saw in 2013, the first year of the study. Interestingly, the number of strip tillers who reported not using any type of GPS guidance held steady at 7% last year. So there's obviously still a percentage of strip tillers out there that are doing just fine, or have not chosen yet to adopt a guidance system on their operation. So kind of breaking down here, much like we did with the strip till rig brands, wanted to take a closer look at the types of GPS systems that strip tillers are utilizing on their farm. And we did find that, once again, John Deere maintained its stronghold as the most popular system by nearly a 2-to-1 margin over second place in 2016. We found that nearly 43% strip tillers utilized Deere systems, down slightly from 2015, ever so slightly. So still obviously very popular. We did see that Trimble held the second spot, down slightly. Ag Leader was in third, and kind of looking at the top 10% then, probably not surprisingly, John Deere again was the most commonly used brand of GPS, about 65% of the top strip tillers utilizing the system. So as I mentioned earlier, kind of looking at some of those other more progressive precision areas that we kind of broke down here and starting to track those, and certainly in the last couple of studies. Variable rate application of fertilizer, which had increased nearly 7 points into 2015, actually dipped again in 2016. So that was kind of interesting. But what we did see was adoption of implement guidance increased dramatically in 2016 to an all-time high of more than 27%, after a low of just over 17% last year. So a new question that we felt worth adding here was asking strip tillers if they utilize an unmanned aerial vehicle system or drone on their operation. and we found that just over 22% said yes. And I'm curious to see in the coming years if that percentage grows, or at the very least remains consistent. And I'm guessing, as more documented return on investment starts to come to light, we may see that number shift. So again, quickly kind of breaking down the top 10%, implement guidance use was up even more dramatically than the overall group, to a record high of 37.5%, well ahead of what we saw in 2015, which was only about 21%. Variable rate also dramatically higher among the top strip tillers, as you can see, above 50% there. And UAV adoption a few points higher at 25%. And again, something worth keeping an eye on as we go into the coming years. So kind of wrapping up here, one of the final questions we asked in our study was just for strip tillers to identify something, anything that they feel is maybe lacking in their operation, and this is more of kind of a wish list, if they could identify something, that they feel would really add value to their system. And, as you can see, we've got a couple of the more interesting suggestions that came up, and certainly a variety of methods and products and techniques, that are certainly kind of on the wish list of strip tillers. So kind of food for thought there. I'm sure some of these things, are certainly in development. Some may be, on the market sooner rather than later, but always interesting to take a look at some of those things. Well, with that, I did want to thank you. That is all the time we've got for today's program. And I did want to remind everyone that today's presentation and audio will be made available on our Strip Till Farmer website. But you can certainly feel free to contact me via email or phone if you have any questions regarding the presentation or on Strip Till in general. I'd be happy to chat with you. And also just another reminder to take advantage of the special $25 registration discount that is being offered courtesy of Ingersoll to attend this year's National Strip Tillage Conference in Omaha. Again, you can call 866-839-8455 and mention priority code Ingersoll, or you can visit striptillconference.com/Ingersoll to take advantage of this limited time offer. And I'd ask that you stay tuned through our e-newsletter and weekly email roundups for upcoming webinar speakers and topics. On behalf of Roger Murdoch and the team at Ingersoll, thank you for joining us today.